Should your choices matter in games that you play? This has been a question that's been asked by many people over many years. And it all comes down to player agency. Player agency is the effect that your choices have on the game. It is the degree to which your actions have consequences in the game. The bigger the consequences for your actions, the more player agency you have. It's basically how much choice you have and how much effect your choice has on the game. But why does player agency matter? Well, when you have higher player agency, that can lead to more engagement or immersion. When players feel their actions matter, they'll feel more invested in the games they play. It can also lead to more replayability, because players will want to go back and see what would have happened if they had made a different decision. It can also increase the ability for the player to express themselves in the game. Because the player's choices matter more, the player can feel free to choose whatever they would like to do, and it will still have an effect on the game, thus providing a meaningful way for the player to change the game and personalize their experience. It can also increase your satisfaction with the game. Player freedom can be a huge benefit for some games. It can also increase the narrative depth of story-driven games, because players will be able to decide how they want the story to go. There are many different ways that developers implement player agency, all the way from adding as much player agency as possible in things such as Minecraft, creating these giant sandbox worlds where you can do basically whatever you want, or reducing player agency down to complete on-rails experiences where your choices don't really matter and you just kind of flow with the game. However, in both of these instances, going too far in one direction or the other with player agency actually reduces how game-like the games are. The reason for this is that when your choices don't really matter at all, then that can make it feel like it's just a story. It's just like you're reading a book or watching a movie. You don't really have any effect on it, and therefore it's not really a game. However, when it's only your choices that matter, then it really just feels like a toy, and it doesn't really feel like the developers actually made an experience or of a message they want to put across. So, it's important to find the right balance of player agency. There's a lot of different types of player agency. For instance, there's narrative agency, where your choices can alter the plot of the story and can affect your in-game characters' relationships with other characters, and it can also affect different possible endings of the story. Another type of player agency that you can have is agency over the world or system, which is where your actions can change the state of the game world. For instance, different factions, how the different factions relate to each other. You could cause different NPCs to attack each other or change their relationship with each other. You can change the environment permanently, such as you might destroy a building or build a building. It could affect the economy. You could trade with different characters. There's all sorts of different ways for the player agency to apply to a world or system. There's also tactical or moment-to-moment agency, which is agency within combat, puzzles, or moment-to-moment gameplay, where you choose how you would like to respond rather than just clicking to continue. In these instances, agency isn't seen as much, but you can still set up some very interesting decisions and create quite a few different interesting consequences for the player's actions. There's also strategic or long-term player agency, which are decisions that have long-term consequences, such as which upgrades to pursue, forming alliances with different factions, choosing to go on different quests. These are longer-term choices, which will have consequences farther down the line. These are the big decisions, and generally what people will think of when they think of player agency. There's also character-player alignment, where it's important for developers who want to have lots of player agency in their game to leave the character open, their personality open, and just make it very unclear what decision that player would make. That way the player doesn't feel like they're going against what the game wants them to do. Whereas in games where the developers want the player to have less agency, they should make the character have a very clear set of beliefs and very clear personality so that it's obvious what that character would do in the situation, and that makes it feel more consistent with the world and character. It's also important with player agency to make sure that players can tell that their actions matter. And you can do this by adding feedback and visibility, where the game needs to respond visibly to your choices. If the player doesn't see the effects of their choice, then it really won't feel like that choice actually mattered at all. Now, in order to design for player agency and make a game that heavily focuses on agency, you first need to decide what kind of agency you want. As I stated before, there's a lot of different types of agency, so it's important to figure out if you want to focus more on narrative branching paths like a you choose adventure, or emergent mechanical agency where the player is just kind of exploring the world and forming their own story? Or do you want to do both? Do you want moment to moment player control where the player is making split second decisions? Or do you want higher level strategic choices where the player is making long term decisions like what areas to invade and what quests to take, or world changing decisions such as if the player should build a castle or if the player will destroy a city? It's important when designing for player agency that we map decision points and consequences. For each choice presented to the players, we need to figure out what things will change. NPC attitude, resource availability, future mission unlocks, story branches, visual or environment changes. It's really important to make sure that we have a clear idea of the different choices and consequences that can come from those choices to make sure we can make it as clear as possible and try to have as many of these as possible so that the player can really personalize their game and we can increase player agency. It's also important to communicate context and feedback. We need to make sure that the player truly understands what sort of consequences their choice will have. In order to make these choices feel meaningful, the player needs to understand what's at stake and what they're doing here. We also should balance breadth versus depth. Having fewer well-developed choices that really can expand and feel deep can often feel better than just a bunch of different choices that don't really have much of an effect or don't really lead to anything farther down the line. Deep consequences can feel stronger than a bunch of small, shallow consequences. It's also important to make sure that all of the choices still satisfy the player, even if it's in a way that may seem dissatisfying. For instance, even if the player loses, make sure that it's apparent to the player that they lost because of their decision and not because of some unfair game mechanic. That way the player won't feel like it was just the game being mean, but they'll want to go back and try again and choose a different choice and see where that leads to. Also, make sure to mix things up. Aside from the high stakes agency where it's like the very meaning of the game could rest upon it, also offer some low stakes agency where it's smaller everyday decisions, such as letting the player choose which cosmetics to put on their character, or changing the dialogue. For instance, players could decide between several different dialogue options that don't have a huge consequence but still allow them to personalize their gameplay. These can offer a refreshing break from the high stakes decisions, because players can feel worn out if they have to make a ton of different decisions that have huge impact. It's also important to manage player expectations. If you present a choice, make sure that the choice matters, but don't tell the player that their choice matters or imply that their choice will matter if it doesn't actually matter, because players really won't like that, especially if you just funnel them all back to the same outcome, no matter what decision they make. Then players will feel cheated and feel like the game was lying to them, which you really don't want. However, player agency isn't all good. There are some trade-offs and there are some potential downsides to it. For instance, the more agency you have in the game, the more complex it gets, because every branch, decision point, and consequence needs testing, balancing. It just leads to more possibilities and therefore more content that has to be created by the game developers. And then also, when the player makes a decision, that locks out a lot of content that might have happened if they'd made a different decision. And therefore, a lot of content in the game can actually go unseen if the player only plays through it once. It's also important to make sure in a story-driven game that the narrative still sounds good and is still consistent with the world, and also still follows the path that developers want without forcing the players into anything too much. Because if you give the player too much agency, then the story could feel really strange and not really at all like a story. It's also important to not present the player with too many choices too quickly or all at once, because the player could easily feel overwhelmed by all the different decisions they need to make. It's important to balance it out with some lighter, smaller decisions, a little bit of space between the player's decisions and actually having to make the next decision. It's also important to align it with the genre and tone of the game. For instance, high-paced action or arcade-style games or linear narrative experiences may deliberately limit agency to preserve pacing or dramatic tension. Because there are certain instances where you just have to not let the player have a decision. Because if the player makes a decision that you don't want them to make, then it might actually lead to the game being just a lesser experience, a worse game. So, in conclusion, it's important to make sure that you balance player agency and don't have too much or too little of it in the game. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.